For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to The Gist on StratNewsGlobal. I'm Surya Gangadharan, and this evening we are looking at Shanghai, where the authorities have triggered a second lockdown or a two-stage lockdown given a rise in coronavirus cases. There are about more than 4,000 cases that have been detected, and the strange thing that we are going to look at is the manner in which China has gone about tackling the rise in COVID cases at a time when the rest of the world appears to have made its peace with the virus in a sense. First of all, I have a graphic for you to look at what China is up to. So as I mentioned a little earlier, the daily COVID count in Shanghai alone has crossed 4,000 cases. It's not a big number, frankly. The city has been divided by the authorities along the Huangpo River, allowing for staggered testing of the population. 17,000 medical personnel have fanned out across the districts to test people, and over 8 million residents were tested on Monday alone, that is yesterday. The official narrative is that the new spike in cases is going to have minimal economic damage and there's nothing to worry about. So that's what the authorities are saying. So many questions rise here. The point is that while the rise in the number of cases is not alarming, yet China has resorted to a complete lockdown of this kind. Why are they doing this? Is it because of issues connected with testing? Is it logistical issues? What exactly is the problem? I have with me Dr. Raj Verma. He is an associate professor of international relations at Huaqiao University in Xiamen, China. Doctor, welcome, glad to have you.
Thank you very much for having me here.
So this Chinese obsession with lockdowns, we've seen them repeatedly all over the place. Is it their way of dealing with this? Don't they realize that lockdowns in other parts of the world are seen as not having really, solved the problem?
Well, I have to say, it's China's way of doing things. Maybe it would be a little bit incorrect because a lot of countries have imposed lockdowns. So say, has China learned anything from lockdowns? Well, it has worked in the past. The virus cases have somehow come up and then subsided because of the stringent measures. So it has worked in the past, and there is no reason why China should somehow dilute this policy or remove this policy. Of course, there's been certain changes have been made in the last couple of months compared to the stringent policy measures which were introduced. For example, they've been reduced a number of days for COVID, quarantine. Testing kits have been provided. People with mild infections don't have to go to hospitals, they can be taken to centers, and there's community testing instead of city-wise testing. And city-wise testing is a very cumbersome process which leads to lockdowns, etc. So there have been concerns, but in large cities like Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, again these kind of lockdowns to a great extent help. Although I should point out that there is a sort of a decline in major cities like Shanghai for the zero COVID strategy. Now, why does China do this? Again, the zero COVID strategy has certain advantages I've mentioned, but there are also disadvantages. One is economic impact. Second is the social impact. People are concerned about the fact that they are unable to work. It leads to a lot of problems. So there's a sort of a lack of support or dwindling of support for this zero COVID strategy. But the most important is the political aspect, because the zero COVID strategy is a political issue. Of course, it has also a medical issue. Political issue is that the Chinese government or the CCP wants to portray that its political system is much better as compared to democratic governments. It's able to curtail COVID cases across China compared to Europe or developed countries, including the US, which have thousands of cases even on a daily basis as we speak. Another reason, as I mentioned, the medical one, is that according to one estimate by Chinese scholars and medical staff, personnel, zero COVID strategy has somehow allowed China to prevent more than 200 million cases and 3 million deaths. that would lead to great political instability in China, because we need to understand that China's political system is a little bit unstable compared to even a democracy like India. We know that we had a second wave in India where thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, people say millions died, the unofficial estimate. Despite that, BJP, led by Prime Minister Modi and Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath, was able to get a very large mandate in the UP elections. And UP was one of the states which suffered the worst outbreak of this second wave. So I don't think China is going to in any way give up on this COVID strategy, at least in 2022. There might be a few changes in 2023, or as we go along. Already we can see there have been some slight changes, but large-scale changes are something which we should not expect in the short to medium term.
Does this also flow from perhaps concern that the Chinese vaccine is not effective enough? There's been a lot of speculation reports about this.
That is to a certain extent correct. We should not say that the Chinese vaccines are not effective. They are effective, but they're not as effective as compared to the mRNA vaccines. So for example, Sinopharm and Sinovac have success rates of maybe 50%, in one study of 51%, which is the threshold, 50 is the threshold, and maybe 78 or 79, and other cases 65. These are much less as compared to the mRNA vaccines, which have close to 90% efficacy rates. Even the AstraZeneca in some cases has 78, in some cases 82. So there's an issue. Another issue relating to leading to a problem in China with the vaccines being a little bit less effective is that certain people in age groups above 60, especially 80, are not willing to or have expressed concerns regarding the third dose vaccination. Some people in China who have children aged 3, 5, 7 in that small age group, they've also expressed concerns or apprehensions regarding the efficacy of the vaccine, or whether, and some have said they would not like their child to be the first one to be administered this vaccine. So if they want to see what the effect is, and then they can make a decision whether they would like their children to be administered the vaccine. So overall, yes, they are effective, but less effective. Yes, there is a concern that that it might not lead to as many or fewer cases as is the case with the mRNA. Some have advocated that at least 3 shots should be administered. 2 is not enough. But again, we also realize that after a period of time, 6 months, 8 months, the efficacy of vaccines by themselves start declining. So they have to be administered again. Whether booster shots are required, whether they can be a combination of Chinese vaccines along with other vaccines, is again a political question, because if you administer, or if the Chinese government administers foreign vaccines, it's an admittance that the Chinese vaccines are not effective. So you can see that foreign vaccines to a large extent are not available in China.
What about the Chinese? What is your sense of the Chinese claim that the economic impact of such lockdowns is minimal, especially in the current case? Are these tenable?
Well, we have to go back a little bit into history. Look at 2020. We see that there was a decline in growth rates when the COVID was peak, and then it boomed. But of course, this is because there's a backlog. But the growth estimates, or according to the 5-year plan, is that the Chinese economy should grow by 5.5% on an annual basis. Because of lockdowns, not just the lockdowns, but also other aspects like the real estate, investment-led growth, and then you have the so-called clamping down of the tech companies. Growth rates will be affected. I have to do primary research to give the exact amount by which the growth rates would decline, but estimates have been made that 5.5% would be difficult to achieve. Maybe it would go to 4.2%, maybe it's going to go to 4.8%, but that is going to be less than the 0.5% cut which the Chinese government has forecast. So yes, there will be large-scale impacts, in the sense 1% or 1.2% GDP cut is substantial in any economy, even if it's the Chinese economy, which is still one of the fastest expanding economies, major economies in the world. So yes, it will be much more, in my opinion, compared to what the government is saying.
So you would say that COVID has deepened the insecurities of the Communist Party leadership?
I wouldn't say it has somehow increased insecurities in the CCP, but what I can say is that it will have these so-called lockdowns and the clamping down of the tech sector will have long-term impacts, ramifications, not just short-term for the economy. Let me give an example. It was estimated by 2027 or 2028, China would overtake the US to become the largest economy in the world. But because of these lockdowns and clampdowns, the new estimate, according to the Japanese Center for Economic Research, and that's one of the latest ones which have come out, is that China would now overtake the US in 2033. If China is able to reverse the trend, increase productivity, increase efficiency or total factor productivity, what we'd like to call it, and not clamp down on the tech sectors and bring in more role of the private sector, then by 2030, 2031, it will be able to overtake the US. So we can see there is a tangible impact of the COVID and other measures taken by the CCP or the Chinese government on the estimated year when the US was to be overtaken by China. Of course, 2 or 3 days ago, there was a statement by one of the prominent Chinese economists that yes, we would still be able to, or China would still be able to overtake the US by 27, 28, but I think that would be problematic or difficult to achieve. Of course, we know that the Chinese government has a bad habit or maybe necessity to fudge the economic data. So chances are that by the end of the year, financial year, they'll still be grew by, if not 5.4%. And then the so-called time or the year of overtaking the US economy would remain more or less the same. But that again raises a lot of questions. Again, the Japan Center for Economic Research also came up with a figure that, which again cannot be certain at this point in time because it's only one study, that China would be able to overtake the US by 2033, but if everything remains the same, then US would be able to overtake China again by 2049. And by 2035, 2036, which is the time for the China Vision 2035, Chinese economy would be bigger than the US economy by only 5%. But then this gap is going to get narrower. And again, the US will become the largest economy by 2050. And then by 2060, Chinese economy would decline to almost 65% of the US economy, 2060, 2065, which is what it was maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So yes, there are major problems for China. These lockdowns might not have the kind of impact, long-term impact, but they do have a short-term impact. And the so-called, maybe these short-term impact might also affect medium to long-term because of the fact that there are backward to forward linkages. Some industries go out of business because of lockdowns. A lot of entrepreneurs shut shops, restaurants have shut, they might never come up again. But again, this is at the lower level, but it might lead to increased income inequalities and poverty in China.
So are there lessons for us in India about how China has gone about tackling COVID?
Yes, we can learn a lot from China. Of course, let me put it this way, the Chinese figures infections, which are reported in the news, are based on city level of mass testing. So they test maybe 10 million people and say, okay, we have 4,000 cases. In India, the number of cases which are reported are those coming to test centers and saying, okay, finding out that they are infected. So we might have more cases than we are coming up with. We don't know. But with China, is one thing that is mass level of testing would ensure, of course, the government can fudge numbers, but it ensures that the government has the accurate number of infections. We don't. In India, we don't have that number. We don't know exactly what is happening. So these are certain things which we can learn. Of course, testing kits, which can be provided at a cheaper price, subsidized if necessary. Then maybe community testing instead of mass testing. But we don't even have community testing in India. So there's a lot to learn, but it all depends on how an autocratic or so-called non-democratic government works, and a democratic government which is to a certain extent dysfunctional or poor governance. So we can learn, but again, it depends on state to state on the level of governance or administration which they have.
So I want to bring in another Indian angle here. The fact that you have so many Indian students studying in Chinese medical universities who are now, last 2 years they've only been here. They're not able to go back. The Chinese say that the situation is not conducive to their return. Is that actually the case? I mean, you've lived there, you've worked there. What's your sense?
I think that is correct. If you look at the zero COVID strategy in China, there are large parts of or people in large parts of China which cannot travel to other provinces or what we call states in India. Yes, I think to say that it's just because India has a border problem or standoff with China, Indian students are not allowed to return to China, that would be incorrect. I think that is false propaganda. We should realize that this strategy is not only for students from India but from large parts of the world. I have students from Pakistan, friends from Pakistan, former students from Pakistan, from Sri Lanka, from Africa, who are unable to return to China. Those who are in China, they're fine, but those who are outside China, they still cannot return to China. As a matter of fact, last year there were some Pakistani students who complained to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, their Minister of Foreign Affairs, and they also put all these things on Facebook that you should allow students from across the world to come, but that has not had an impact on the Chinese government. And why should the Chinese government in any way change that strategy? We should also take into account that in maybe around September, October, and the memory serves me right, 2020, China allowed students or people from India to travel to China, but on those flights, when they landed in China, 50% of the occupants of the flights had COVID or asymptomatic COVID cases. So point is, that how can that happen? In a 5 or 6 hour flight, it's not possible to be infected and not 50% of the occupants. So the other issue is that we in India should look at the fact that some of the COVID certificates which are being provided are a problem. And that is not the case only with China. Even the UK complained that when they land, things are not what they should be like. A large number of COVID cases, which should not be the case, because in airport they're tested, which just raises questions about the governance and administration and the measures taken by officials at the Indian level, and not at the Chinese level. So to blame China for not allowing Indian students to return is not the case, of course. In my opinion, of course, I might be wrong, and I hope that is not the case. I know so many people who have been working in China whose contracts have now expired and they can't return to China. Their universities, schools and other officers want them to return, but they cannot return.
In fact, that brings me to these 5,000 odd Indians who are working in Chinese enterprises, who are now here with their families. They can't go back. And again, it's the same set of issues.
It's the same issue. We should not make too much of this. It's their government's decision. Now, the government decision sometimes is not what the private enterprises or the universities want, but it's government policy. That's the way it is. And yes, there are problems in working. Yes, livelihoods are affected. Some of these families members might be in India, some might be in China, but that is what it is. And yes, we can say that there are problems, but to blame it on Chinese government just because of the India-China border standard, that would be incorrect.
So last question, would you care to hazard a guess as to when these restrictions could be lifted?
Not this year, that is for sure, because of the party congress and the term extension for President Xi. We initially thought that if the caseload in China would be very low, it might be the Olympics, after the Paralympics, but of course then there were large number of cases in Xiamen, and then as you can see what has happened. I don't think so 2022. Maybe optimistically March 2023 or even August. But it all depends on how many people are vaccinated across the world. If the number of cases across the world are declining, then there might be a chance that China might allow international travel. It's not to say there is no international travel in China. It's very restricted. And of course, when people do enter China, they have to go through the 2-week quarantine period, and then when they return to their homes, they still have to be monitored for another week or so, or sometimes more, depending on which province you are in, because all provinces have different rules and regulations. So I don't think 2022, hopefully 2023. But again, if we have another strain of COVID which emerges, as some might say, saying that New Delhi might have a fourth wave in June this year, and there's a new transmutation, a mutation, who knows? But I think we might be able to get vaccines. Again, this Omicron variant is something which we did not have vaccines for, and this is what is affecting China now. Hopefully, things should get back on track by August 2023.
We'll hope for the best. Raj Verma, thank you. Pleasure talking to you as always.
Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you.
And for all of you out there who are following this conversation, continue to come to us with your questions and observations. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on social media, Twitter and Instagram. Thank you. Good night.